Walter Hensley is 83 years old, and tonight, for the first time in 60 years, he is going to eat dinner completely alone. No phone call, no knock on the door, no one checking if he is okay. Just an old man, a quiet kitchen, and a silence so loud it feels like it has weight. If you think this is just another sad story about an old man, wait until you hear what he gave up to become the man nobody remembers. Because somewhere between raising a family, burying a wife, and giving away pieces of himself to everyone who needed him, Walter forgot to save anything for himself. And tonight, sitting at that same wooden table where he once fed 4 hungry children, he finally asks himself a question he has been avoiding for 80 years. What was it all for? Walter grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew your name and nobody locked their doors. His father worked in a factory. His mother cleaned houses. There was never much money, but there was always enough love to go around, at least in the beginning. By the time Walter was 12, his father had left, and Walter, being the oldest, quietly stepped into a role no child should have to fill. He started working after school. He gave his mother every dollar he earned. He learned early that being a good man meant disappearing a little, so that everyone else could stay whole. Nobody taught Walter how to ask for help. Nobody ever asked if he was tired. So he simply kept going year after year, believing that his worth was measured only by how much he could give away. At 19, Walter married a woman named Evelyn, the only person who ever made him feel like he didn't have to earn love. They built a small life together, a modest house, a used car, and eventually, for children who filled every corner of that home with noise and laughter. Walter worked 2 jobs for most of his life. He missed birthdays, he missed recitals, he came home smelling like sawdust and diesel, too exhausted to talk, but never too exhausted to make sure there was food on the table. He told himself this was love. He told himself sacrifice was the same thing as devotion. But somewhere along the way, nobody ever stopped to ask Walter what he needed. Here is something most people never realize about good men like Walter. They don't break loudly, they don't collapse in front of everyone. They break quietly, alone, in rooms nobody else walks into. There was a night, when Walter was 34, that he sat alone in his truck after a double shift and cried for the first time since he was a boy. Not because he was weak, but because for one single moment, he let himself feel how tired he truly was. Then he wiped his face, walked inside, and asked his children about their day, because that is what good men do. They swallow their pain so it doesn't become someone else's burden. Nobody ever knew about that night. Not Evelyn, not his children. He carried it alone, the way he carried almost everything. Walter's children grew up loved, fed, and protected, but they grew up believing their father simply didn't need anything, because he never once said otherwise. That belief would follow all of them for decades, and it would come back around in a way none of them expected. Because a man who spends his whole life proving he needs nothing eventually convinces the world he was telling the truth. And the world, unfortunately, tends to believe him. Evelyn passed away when Walter was 71. Cancer took her slowly, over 18 months, and Walter was there for every single appointment, every sleepless night, every whispered fear at 3 in the morning. He held her hand until her final breath, and then, 3 days later, he went right back to mowing the lawn, because he didn't know what else a man was supposed to do with grief that big. His children called sometimes. They visited on holidays. But life moved forward the way life always does, and somewhere in that motion, Walter quietly slipped into the background of his own story. This is the part of Walter's life that almost nobody talks about, the 12 years after Evelyn died, when a strong, capable man slowly became invisible in the eyes of the people he raised. At first, it was small things. Nobody called just to check on him. Nobody asked how he was really doing, only if he was doing fine, which he always answered with the same tired smile. Then holidays became shorter. Visits became rushed. His grandchildren grew up seeing him twice a year, mostly through a phone screen, mostly for a few polite minutes. Walter never complained. He told himself they were busy, that this was simply how life worked, that good men don't burden their families with loneliness. But every single night, when the house went quiet, that loneliness sat right next to him at the dinner table, uninvited and impossible to ignore. Here is something Walter learned that most people discover far too late in life. Loneliness is not about being physically alone. It is about being forgotten by the very people you gave your entire life to protect. There was one afternoon, just last spring, when Walter fell in his backyard while trying to fix a broken fence post alone, because he didn't want to bother anyone. He lay there for almost 40 minutes before he managed to crawl back inside. He never told his children. Not because he wanted to hide it, but because deep down, a small, painful part of him already knew what the silence on the other end of that phone call would feel like. And that silence, more than the fall itself, was the thing that truly hurt him. But something happened after that fall, something that changed everything, something Walter never expected at 83 years old. A young nurse named Grace, sent to check on him for a routine home visit, noticed something the rest of the world had missed for years. She noticed his hands, calloused and trembling, still trying to fix things around the house nobody else came to fix. She noticed the faded photographs on his wall, and the way his eyes lit up, just for a moment, when he spoke about his children. And instead of rushing through her checklist, she sat down, made a cup of tea, and simply asked him one question nobody had asked him in over a decade. "Walter, what do you need?" Walter didn't answer right away. In fact, he couldn't. 83 years of silence doesn't break in a single moment. But something inside him cracked open just enough to let the truth spill out, slowly, painfully, honestly, for the very first time in his entire life. He told her about the truck and the night he cried alone at 34. He told her about Evelyn's final breath and the 12 lonely years after. He told her about the fall in the backyard and the 40 minutes he spent staring at the sky, wondering if anyone would notice if he simply disappeared. And for the first time since he was a boy, Walter Hensley allowed another human being to witness his pain, instead of quietly carrying it alone. This is the moment everything changed, not because his loneliness disappeared, but because he finally understood something he wished someone had told him 60 years earlier. Being a good man was never supposed to mean disappearing. It was never supposed to mean silence or sacrifice without limits, or convincing the world you need nothing until they actually believe it. A good man is allowed to be tired. A good man is allowed to ask for help. A good man is allowed to say, out loud, that he is lonely, without feeling like that makes him weak. Grace encouraged Walter to call his children, not to guilt them, but simply to tell them the truth, so he did. He called his oldest daughter and said 4 words he had never said in 83 years. "I need you sometimes." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then she started to cry, because she had spent her whole life believing her father needed nothing, when the truth was he simply never told her otherwise. That single phone call changed everything. His children started visiting more. His grandchildren started calling just to talk. Not out of guilt, but because Walter finally gave them the one thing he had withheld his entire life, honesty about his own heart. If there is one thing Walter Hensley wants people to understand from his story, it is this. Sacrifice without honesty is not love. It is silence disguised as strength. And silence, no matter how noble it feels, eventually leaves even the strongest men sitting alone at empty tables. Today, Walter still lives in that same small house in Ohio. But the dinner table looks different now. Sometimes it is filled with laughter again. Sometimes his grandchildren sit beside him, asking him questions about his life, actually listening to the answers. And sometimes, when the house is quiet, Walter simply sits in gratitude, not because his loneliness completely disappeared, but because he finally allowed himself to be truly seen. So if you take one thing away from Walter's story, let it be this. Do not wait 83 years to tell the people you love what you actually need. Do not mistake silence for strength, or sacrifice for the absence of your own worth. Being good to others should never mean disappearing from your own life. Check on the strong ones. Check on the quiet ones. Check on the men who never ask for help, because sometimes the people who give the most are simply waiting for someone to finally ask them, "What do you need?" And if somewhere out there, someone in your life has spent their whole existence taking care of everyone else, call them today. Not tomorrow, today. Because the loneliest people in the world are often the ones who spent their entire lives making sure nobody else ever felt alone.